Welcome to An Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terrence Franklin. In each episode, we go on an odyssey to discover my family history, and I invite guests to share their stories to bend the arc of history with their own legacy. You can find the show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Now please, join me for An Archbender's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I'm your host, Terry Franklin. Hi, and welcome to the show. I'm so excited today to have Portia Wood here with me. Our guest is Portia. She's a generational wealth planning attorney based in Los Angeles, and she leads the Wood Legal Group, LLP, an African-American, woman-owned and operated mother-daughter law firm specializing in planning, probate, and elder law. She and her mother and her law partner, Robin Wood, are passionately focused on helping all families grow and protect wealth. Now, you can find out more about her by following or going to woodlegalgroup.com. But I'm going to get a chance to sit here and chat with her a little bit today. I do trust and estate litigation, so we have a little crossover here. So welcome, Portia.
Oh, Terry, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you today. Thank you.
Thank you for coming on with us and spending some time and sharing some knowledge and information. I know that you and your mom are committed to trying to close America's racial wealth gap. And, I've thought that was important. I've done stuff in connection with that issue for the ACTEC Planning for a Diverse and Equitable Future video podcast. But I'm wondering why it's important to you and what's driving you to try to make a difference in that area.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is a big question, right? I think a rising tide raises all boats. And so from my family history and my family legacy, we've always been taught throughout the generations that when you know better, you do better. And once you know better, you have to teach others. And one of the things that I had the opportunity was to learn about sort of estate planning and intergenerational wealth, sort of by accident, right? I was in law school. This was not my journey. I was going to be a criminal defense attorney, and I was going to support our community in that way. And I had space in my calendar and needed a class, right? And estates and trust just happened to fill that hole that I had because it was an elective. It wasn't a required course in law school. Right. And so I ended up taking this course, and I remember this transformational shift from everything that I thought I knew about estates and trusts, like what the media had portrayed and all of those things, what I'd heard even in my own family, and all of the nuances that can be used to build and preserve wealth intergenerationally. And I sat in that course and I was like, our community doesn't know this. And I still stayed on my career path through criminal law for several years. And as we started to see the rise in the movement for Black lives, I started actively protesting, actively participating in legal measures around police reform. And as I looked at what was going on, the question of economics kept coming back up. And I wanted to understand why we were starting over from zero every generation.
Over and over.
Why we couldn't make any headway. So I started doing research on the economics. We talk a lot about, businesses and life insurance and all these things, but the missing part of the conversation is always the estate plan. It's always, how do we preserve what we've already created so that the next generation starts from that level up, right? And what the numbers showed was that we weren't doing that. In fact, 14% of college-educated African Americans are getting $10,000 or more to the next generation. Only 14%.
Wow.
It's astonishing. We're losing the majority of our wealth at the generation gap, right? The generation transfer, if you will. And so I sort of said to myself and said to my mom, we know how to do this, right? We should be telling everyone we can. Right. And that's what we started doing is really trying to protect families one at a time and educate on platforms like these as many people as possible so that we can take agency over our own legacies and preserve everything we've been working for.
That makes so much sense. Was your mom already doing trust and estates work? Is that what she was doing before, or?
No, so yes and no, right? So she worked in the nonprofit sector.
Okay.
And so what she saw was, multi-million dollar and billion-dollar families that left charitable remainder trusts, and oftentimes working with those families to continue to support the nonprofits through their charitable efforts through either their foundations or their estate plans. And so she had a really intimate behind the curtain look at how some of the best estate plans were put together, particularly the tax benefits, right? The conversation around what kind of tax benefits can you get today for continuing to be charitable, et cetera. And so she had a really good look at excellent estate planning from some of the highest levels. And I, on the other hand, was in litigation. And so I was doing real estate litigation and commercial litigation. And I saw the fights, right? I saw all the things that happened when people didn't have a plan at all. Exactly, right? Your life, what you see, and all of the loss that comes in when people don't have planning in place.
Right.
And ultimately, I would say that I'm also the beneficiary of very rudimentary estate planning that has reverberated throughout 6 generations. And just the little tweak of doing a plan and being really intentional about it, how that can impact generations. And being someone who was the beneficiary of that, I feel like it's important to continue to share with other families about how they themselves can change their trajectory.
Wow, that resonates with me so much. I wrote an article a couple of years ago, just sort of asking the question, why is it that so many African Americans, us Black people, don't tend to have estate plans? And I sort of thought about it, it was all sort of random speculation, but when you think about the fact that we were brought to this country as property, and even once we could legally obtain property, that there was Jim Crow and redlining and all kinds of legal maneuvers that took property away from us. And at least for me, I had the sense that maybe for a lot of us, it's like, what's the purpose? Why bother to try to hold on to something that you're going to pass on to the next generation, because somebody's just going to take it from you anyway? But we know from the statistics that the wealth gap is huge and continues to grow. And one of the fundamental things that causes that gap to grow is that we aren't trained as a cultural matter, and for many of us, to make sure that we are transferring this wealth that we accumulate during our lifetimes from generation to generation. So I love what you're doing. This is
Thank you.
Great work.
Thank you. Yeah, I would say, much to what you've just said, right? There's also this narrative that's been promoted to our community that people need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? I did it, so you have to. And what people don't realize is we live in a society that depends on the next generation inheriting something from the previous. And we are seeing that today, the amount of growth and inflation and costs. It really is the haves and the have-nots, right? Those who have assets are able to weather the storms and leverage that into more assets, and those that don't can't, right? And we're going to continue to see that go down the road. Right now, we're on the precipice of one of the largest wealth transfers in the history of this country. We're talking about, $70 trillion plus changing hands from the baby boomer population to the subsequent generations. And it's happening now, and we are wholly unprepared for it as a community. So right now, I sort of scream it from the rooftops. People get a little bit annoyed with me sometimes, I think, because we're in such a state of emergency. Right. That is a silent emergency. People don't see it. They don't know that it's coming or that they're being impacted by it right now. But 70% of African Americans have no estate planning at all. And we are slated to lose all of the gains that we've been able to make over these few decades, just because we don't have a plan in place to preserve it.
Right. So it's about getting the word out, and education. And if you don't mind, I am a little curious about, you said there was a rudimentary estate plan that resulted in you having some benefit 6 generations later.
Yeah.
You want to share a little bit about it? I have a few minutes.
That sounds like I have to ask. Yeah. So my great 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 grandfather was born enslaved in Montgomery County, Maryland. And it is presumed that he was the truly the biological child of his enslaver. It's presumed, but unknown at this point. When his enslaver passed away, he was inherited essentially as property by his biological aunts, because the enslaver had no legitimate children. The aunts allowed him to buy his own freedom, subsequently the freedom of his wife, and then the freedom of his 4 children, and then the land that he tilled as an enslaved person. At his death, he ended up owning about 900 acres of land that he had tilled as an enslaved person. And he did a rudimentary will. Basically said, I pass all of this to my children equally. But one line that really changed it all: if you're going to sell, you must offer it to your siblings first.
Oh.
And it kept the land in our family until about the 70s,
Wow.
1970, right? We're talking about almost 200 years of land preservation because of the little tweak that it would be offered into the family. That land is now parkland and owned by the state here in Maryland, which is a whole different conversation. But my great great grandmother sold her parcel to her brother, and with the proceeds, she gave it to her, a portion of it to her husband, and he bought the Afro-American newspaper, which is the longest continuously running Black newspaper in the country. It's about 132 years old. It still exists. It's still family owned because the shares are in trust, which keeps it moving down the family line. So when I say that not only has our family been very much instilled with this idea of once you know better, you do better and you share, so much so we have a newspaper, we also, it still exists in the format that it does because of estate planning. And it wasn't until I started really delving into this myself, right? My sister is now running the Afro Archives. And so she really discovered this story about land and where the money came from, because we didn't really know it before. And she unearthed this connection and has been exploring it ever since, and has done many projects on the land subsequently. And so I created a course on the power of an inherited home, the power of land and estate planning. And so we're teaching that, if you can properly protect and leverage land, it can create wealth for generations. But you have to do it on the front end.
That is really, because my whole story and my mission, my destiny has been connected to uncovering the will that emancipated my ancestors in the 1840s, and trying to find out how these legacies from the past that are out there, that exist, that are part of our DNA, can inspire us to try to do better, as you say, and to try to leave behind something that's, greater for those that come after. Where, there's so many issues with what heirs property, and I know Thomas Mitchell got a MacArthur grant a couple of years ago to try to look at the issue of how property gets dissipated, typically because there is no planning, especially in the South, where families own, 1/92nd interest of a property, and the one person who's been paying the taxes is old and tired and doesn't want to do it anymore. And then the family is going to lose it because some speculator will swoop in and buy it for cheap. And you're advocating for trying to do something that does a little bit better, aren't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's always easier when you are the one, right? When there's one or there's like 3, say, siblings, getting them to think more creatively about the land, right? Creating a family limited partnership, creating a family LLC or some kind of business around the land, and then finding a profitable venture for it. Sometimes that might be going on, and today it's easier than ever before, right? There are websites where you can rent out your barren land for campers who just want to be able to pitch a tent. And you can do nothing else but just coordinate having someone come in to be able to pitch a tent. You could do wind farms, you can do solar farms. If you just have vacant land, you can do farming. There's all sorts of options for monetizing this land that's left behind. But too many times people think of it as a burden. They go, oh, I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't know how to think about it. I don't know anything about land. I'm not a farmer. I live in the city. And they let it go because we don't understand its value.
Right.
Land has always been the wealth creator in this country. Businesses go up and down, they disappear, but the ownership of land has always been what is able to be leveraged against, what has the best tax benefits in our society. You know, when we think about assets, it's land. And if you should be benefit by having a home on that land that someone can live in, a little bit of structure goes a long way. And sometimes I tell my clients, you know, remove the emotion from the home.
Right.
There's the idea of the family home, but family is a business as well. And that one home could provide homes for everyone, right? It's seed capital, but it's only an asset if somebody else is responsible for paying for it. If
Right.
one of the family members lives there, it's a liability. It doesn't generate anything for you. But grandma's one home, right? That one paid off home, I don't care where it is in the country. If you decide nobody can live there, no family member, unless they pay fair market rent, and you put it in your documents, that's all they can do is either not live there or pay fair market rent. Well, if they can't afford that, or that's not the best use, guess what they can do, right? They can use it as a rental. Someone else can pay fair market rent for that home. And what does that give you? Income. And that means you can leverage against that property. Go take out a tax-free mortgage on that home that's not more than the fair market rent. And now that loan is being paid by your tenant, and you have a large swath of cash, tax-free, that you can go use as a down payment on your next piece of property, or to start a business, or to pay for college education so that there isn't student loan debt. What other communities have been doing for generations, which is why the wealth gap continues to grow, we've got to get into that game. And
Yeah.
it starts with setting up an estate plan that is comprehensive and complete, right? It has to do more. At the bare minimum, it has to avoid court, right? As you know.
Right.
But it has to do more than that if we want to perpetuate wealth.
This is fascinating. You know, I wish I'd grown up with quite, that kind of out of the box thinking, especially about the importance of property. I was talking to a gentleman last night at an event, and he and his partner, this is what they do. They deal with land that is vacant land. So
Mm-hmm.
they buy it, they lease it out for solar, for wind,
Mm-hmm.
for whatever, and have
Whatever.
earned huge profits. But it's about thinking about it and planning for it and making sure that you can sustain yourself otherwise by developing a proper plan. So this
Exactly.
is what you do. And
Yeah.
how young is too young to start thinking about the importance of estate planning and making sure that
Mm.
it's in place?
You know, the moment someone turns 18, they need an estate plan. We just don't all need the same estate plan, right? Once you become a legal adult in our society, nobody is automatically your fiduciary.
Right.
Now, every state is a little bit different in the way that that works. But let's say, you send your kid off to college and something happens, unfortunately. The school's not going to give you any information. The doctors aren't going to allow you to make decisions on long term. You may not even get access to their apartment unless your name is on their lease, because they are a legal adult with a right to privacy. And just because you're their parent doesn't give you the access to break into their assets, right? Their bank accounts, to get information about them that's private if they haven't shared it. And it's a rude awakening, unfortunately, for many parents when they realize that and then have to go through a guardianship or conservatorship proceeding to be able to get legal authority over their child.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean that your child needs a multi-generational estate plan, right? But they need the basics. They need powers of attorney for property. They need healthcare directives. And perhaps they need a simple will, something that just says, this is who I want my things to go to. If they have children, it starts to get a little bit more complicated because now we need to name guardians. Now we need to talk about, well, do we have life insurance and how is that life insurance held? Do we create a trust around that, right? And then on and on and on. But the baseline is, who's going to take care of me, my finances, my personhood, if I'm incapacitated? If I have a car accident or I get COVID-19 or whatever the next new thing that's, pandemic or whatever that's coming down the pike, if something happens to me, who is legally authorized to access my bank account and pay my bills and start a lawsuit on my behalf, call anyone?
That's
Second,
so important.
who makes my medical decisions, right? Who is legally empowered to say, what happens to me medically? And then third, where does all my stuff go if I don't make it? If whatever happened to me is fatal, who should get all of my assets? And that's just a baseline.
Because I think we tend to underestimate the
Yeah.
possibility of something going wrong, that somebody gets sick or ill, even for a short period of time. And we
Mhm.
also disregard the reality that
Right,
everybody's going to die at some point. And so we
right.
all need to be prepared and anticipate that that moment is going to come. And even at the youngest age, when it's, as you say, a kid could be in a minor accident away at college or something like that. I think that's such a good
Yeah.
reminder about the importance of recognizing developing some kind of estate plan at any point, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we offer child protection plans. Really, it's like the college package. So as kids are getting ready to go back to school and they're turning 18 or getting ready to, working with their parents collaboratively to make sure that there's something in place and let the kids say, right? They don't generally think about it, but I find that the sooner we start, the more focused they are on sort of their economics, on what it looks like to create a legacy, because we planted the seeds early,
Hmm.
right? And so as we go along, they tend to keep coming back to us and saying, okay, well, what else can we take, right? What other courses do you have on information about where we might be focusing our attention or what we can do now to build a larger estate? And I find that that comes from starting the conversation with their college protection plans. Here's what it looks like for how you move along in this world as an adult and really start to as the kids say, adult in our society.
I think that's important, especially because a lot of parents think they think these things are important, but they don't have the resources. They don't know, they
Mhm.
haven't really thought about how this is all going to fit together or who to call or how it gets done. But I know that, there are, uh, I'll say, wealthy people who are not African American,
Mhm.
who create all kinds of family family offices where they bring young
Mhm.
people in early on to think about
Yeah.
things like charitable planning and developing a
Mhm.
sense of the importance of utilizing and stewarding assets during your lifetime so that you can leave something that's a legacy or a gift for the people who come after you. And I
Yeah.
guess going down that line, what's the Black Trust Fund Kids? Can you tell me?
Yeah, so the Black Trust Fund Kids was born out of the pandemic, actually. I've got to give a nod to Clubhouse for this one. It was the middle of the night. I got an invitation to Clubhouse, and I just started talking about Black intergenerational wealth. And I was talking on all of these other people's stages, and I realized that people didn't know anything about estate planning, and they were thirsty for more information. And so we formed a club called the Black Trust Fund Kids Club on Clubhouse, and it grew to more than 20,000 people. And then we saw sort of all of this excitement around information that people were looking for. Um, we then took it over to TikTok because Clubhouse is difficult to sustain, and we grew that community to over 65,000 people. And then we launched a website, which is currently in beta and is going to be its own formal club with a lot of coursework that we've been developing over the last few years to educate people, where we can come together similar to kind of that family office concept in the sense that we've brought in a bunch of other professionals in the financial space and life insurance space, CPAs, to come in and talk and teach about what they do and how it all interplays together so that people can create their wealth building team in one place. Because not all of us can afford to have the family office, right? We don't have the bare minimums, but we need those people in our corner to be able to build our wealth so we can get there, right? We also need the information for ourselves. There's too much out there that is conflicting. There's a lot of noise. I saw something the other day where someone was saying you can create a living revocable trust to avoid your creditors. And I was like, that is not accurate. I'm
Mm.
like, and it's like you see all of this noise and people tend to shut down because they don't know what to believe. And so we took the community that we just sort of built organically throughout the pandemic and have formalized it into a place, a resource hub for people to get good information and to find other professionals, Black and Brown professionals predominantly, that they can work with to build their own wealth building team for their family. Because it doesn't have to cost a lot, you just have to be intentional about it. And once you set the intention, you'll realize that it all sort of comes together. And that's really the space that we've been creating.
This is great because you're like creating new things, recognizing these places where there are gaps, if I'm not overusing the word gap today, and then trying to fill those needs with creative ideas and bright thinking and creating a trusted platform, because that's so important for people because they're dealing with money. And I, that was another part of my article, was the idea that I think people are afraid. We've had property stolen from us by this person or that person or an advisor who didn't quite know what they were doing. But to really have a place that's a resource that you can trust is vital for people in order to be willing to take those steps, right?
Absolutely. I mean, and I find that it is the younger generation that is so much more receptive. Our elders are still very fearful. And they've lived through some times that make them so, right? When we think about how many man-made lakes in the United States are covering up so much wealth in our community, right? When we think about Black Wall Street and just the history of the Tulsa riots and the bombings that came in there, and when we think about that history and the people that are still alive today that experienced that, and what the generational trauma was from how they were taught about money, right? I actually did a clubhouse room. I'm talking about Clubhouse a lot today. That's weird. But I did a clubhouse room on 100 years after Tulsa. And we had a woman who was born there, and she said, we don't even talk about it. It wasn't until I left and went to college that I learned about what happened in the place where I grew up. People were so afraid they wouldn't even speak about it. And I was taught as a child not to shine so too brightly as to not draw attention, because I didn't want anyone in the community to wonder about what we might have and come and take it. And so when you think about that history of what's being instilled in our elders, but when they were young people, about how to hide to protect themselves, we lost a lot about that community and wealth building. And so there's so many young people now who have found each other via the internet and social media and are having these conversations and saying, there's another way to do this. The access and information is, I think, what's going to bridge this wealth gap in these next generations, if we can really take action. And we're going to bring our parents and our grandparents along. We're going to help to show them, right, by doing.
I love that you're taking those steps and moving us forward, because that's my whole mission, is to try to bend the arc of history towards justice, either by sharing, especially by sharing my family's story. But that's really what you're doing. Do you have anything, as we sort of wrap up here, that you'd like to leave with our guests? Either one thing that you wish every family would take action to do today to protect wealth, or how you might encourage people to help bend the arc of history towards justice?
Yeah. Individually, right? And collectively as a family, have the family dinner. Not just when you come together and talk about the day, but talk about the finances. In our office, we do something called the family dinner, where people will have me come out either virtually or in person and lead, right, a conversation around money and economics. And everybody really has to be willing to have that conversation. What does the economics look like? What are our credit scores? What is our goal as a family? Whose estate plan is where? Who should take charge? Because when we can remove the family from the court system, right, when somebody becomes ill or passes away, and we can minimize and reduce family fighting, right there, we're already saving huge amounts of money inside of one family. If we can create an intentional plan that everybody's on board with, or at least everybody is knowledgeable of, right, then we can actually work collaboratively towards a brighter future for that family. So when you sit down at family dinner with grandma and grandpa and mom and dad and your siblings, and maybe even your kids, have those kinds of conversations today. don't assume that what you know, they know. Don't assume that what you've done, they've done, because in many instances, right, it's not the case. 70% of African Americans have no estate planning at all, and less than 3% of African Americans have comprehensive estate planning. So we have about 97% of our population that is not properly covered with estate planning to actually preserve the wealth that they've built. We've got to be talking and sharing with one another. So when you learn something, sit down, bring it to your collective and your community, and then take action.
I love it. Our work is cut out for us.
Absolutely.
And even though I make my living in a firm that only does trust and estate litigation, I'm not worried that people are ever going to stop. That people are going to stop failing to do the estate plans and dying with money, because it's always been true. But if we can get a few people to focus, as you're suggesting, and more of us, especially Black and brown people, especially African Americans, who are trying to overcome this wealth gap, maybe we can actually make a difference. And I just want to thank you for coming here and sharing with me about what you do and how you make a difference. Are you based in Maryland? Is that where you're based, or?
So our firm operates in California, Maryland, DC, and Virginia. Okay. We do have some counsels all over the country, but we're primarily California and Maryland, DC, Virginia. Yeah.
Okay. So I knew you were Pepperdine Law, but I also saw the Maryland connections. I wanted to make sure. Based on all that.
I've done a lot of school. What can I say?
That was the other thing. We were all told education, put it in your head, because what's in your head, they can't take from you. But the stuff that's not in your head, we need to pass that along too. So
absolutely.
Thank you for your words of encouragement and advice and support. And I hope that people get the message that it's up to us to make the difference for those who come after. So thank you, Portia.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. Have a great weekend.
Thank you for tuning in to an Archbinder's Journal, The Last Will of Lucy Sutton. I've been your host, Terrence Franklin. You can find this show through YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.